everybody. I'm David Layton-Brown, the Master of McLaughlin College, and I want to A, do a bit of business, and then B, give some gratitude, and finally get around to introducing our speaker. Business is students in the room. If you have not signed in at the register by the door, please do so before you leave. It's not just that we want to know how many people have come, but we want to give a certificate of participation to students who attend 6 or more of our lunch talks. And the only way we know if you've attended 6 or more of our lunch talks is if you've signed in on 6 or more occasions. So even if this is the first one you've been to, there are more to come. Please keep your options open and please do sign in. Secondly, I want to thank, as I often do, and probably not often enough, the York Collegium on Practical Ethics, who are the co-sponsors of today's talk, as they are of so many of our talks. We couldn't put on the program of lunch talks that we do without them. It's just an absolutely crucial and marvelous partnership, and I'm really grateful. You're all grateful, whether you know it or not. And finally, I want to introduce our speaker today. Professor Ray Rogers is someone who I've known in different capacities for a lot of years now. First got to know him when he was a graduate student. He and I had the marvelous opportunity to be among the York University delegation to an international conference in Beijing, which was marvelous. Nothing to do with what he's talking about today, I think, but marvelous. After his PhD, Ray became a faculty member in the Faculty of Environmental Studies and has progressed to loftier positions in the Faculty of Environmental Studies since. And we are really fortunate that he will be speaking to us today. It sounds almost like a Faculty of Health talk that he will be giving. And in case you don't know what the title is, the fact that it's up on the screen behind me, I'll let Ray explain why that's the title that he's talking about today. Over to you, Ray.
Thank you, David. Very nice to be here. I also remember we went to Washington together as well, and I remember that one of your traditions was to buy a joke tie in Washington. I don't see, you don't have one on today, though, your joke tie. Remember that in Washington? You went off to buy your joke tie. Anyway, good to be here. So I also want to thank McLaughlin College. I'm very involved with the transition year program, which gives opportunities to students who experience systemic barriers in terms of post-secondary education. And McLaughlin College has hosted the transition year program for the last 7 years. So very grateful for that. It's a great program, and I'm pleased to be involved with it. So, yes, it's a very unusual title. Are environmentalists hysterical or paranoid? Bit of a joke, but there's also something very serious going on as well, I think, in terms of how we conceptualize environmental issues and those who are involved, right? So this is a kind of activist talk, right? So there is a recognition, I think, that public policy has, in a large part, has failed in terms of environmental issues, right? So the standard kinds of procedures, the standard approaches we have to environmental issues have been an almost complete failure in terms of nature conservation. Right? And I think climate change is the most recent battle, and it doesn't look too promising in that vein either. So what I'm providing today is that something more is required. It's a more contentious, conflictive situation that recognizes inequalities in terms of power relations, these deeply kinds of contested territories, right? And I'm going to conclude by saying a few things about a biocentric environmental ethic, how we might think about ourselves. And this, of course, relates back to hysteria and paranoia to some extent, and the idea of animated elsewheres, right? And the disappearance of, the creation first of animated elsewheres and their disappearance. So this concept of an animated elsewhere, right? So we want to think about caring. Thinking about caring. That's what we want to kind of reflect on today in terms of practical ethics, in terms of things that Phyllis talked about. And so, to some extent, in this brief half hour or so, it's a postcard from the trenches of care, right? Because these are struggles, and it's a struggle, and a conflicted struggle, but about something about caring. You know, it's a kind of unusual territory, right? It's very contested, conflictive, and we're struggling about how to care about the natural world. And once again, as I say, it's this idea of processes of denigration. And what you find lots of times in very conflictive situations is that there will be ways in which power presents itself by, in terms of denigrating particular groups who are contesting certain kinds of decisions, situations, social injustice, these kinds of things, right? And so, of course, in radical environmentalism or many different groups are seen as tree huggers, right? They feel too much. They care. Women are throughout history have been always, they feel too much, right? So they're always tagged with that kind of criticism, right? I'm always very, very suspicious when someone says that you feel too much, right? Especially when we're reflecting on caring here. I mean, feeling too much might, be a good idea these days, right? So when I become very suspicious when someone starts to use language that, what the term, simple thing we all understand, tree hugger, right? And so rather than denigrate those who contest and those who probably have less power and authority in our culture, I'm going to try and highlight the fact that the dominant structures are impoverished. So I'm going to turn the tables a little bit for a little while today and talk about how impoverished our current dominant structures are. And that's my goal for today. So this idea, we have here's kind of three examples. This idea of practical ethics. So let's just set out three examples. First one is, just in general, if you ask people, do you want to live in a world where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer and more, and the planet gets destroyed in the process? We'd all say no, right? We'd all say no. But we do live in that kind of world, right? We live in that kind of world. Like, what has happened? So that's just kind of a large, kind of big, general question to begin with. Why? Like, why, when all of us, if we were asked in a kind of personal way, we wouldn't want to live in that kind of world, and yet we do? Like, what's happened to our care no longer operationalizes itself in the world, it seems. There's a kind of passivity somehow that's happened there, right? Second one is, second example, tragedy of the commons metaphor, probably the most famous metaphor in environmental studies, and it's done probably as much good as it has done damage in terms of environmental debates. But in that article, Hardknuck says that conscience is self-eliminating. So we just pause for a minute and think about that, right? For someone, we're reflecting on ethics and care. And the idea that conscience is self-eliminating, that if you care, you take yourself out of the game. Right? To act on your conscience is to be a dupe. To not get into the shopping spree. Right? To sort of to pause and reflect on what's going on just takes you out of the game. So that's it's a very kind of dramatic statement for us to, when we're thinking about care, it's a very dramatic kind of comment. And I think this is connected to the fact that, you conceptualize that there's a new kind of environmental problem for which there's not a technical solution. So what this highlights is, in fact, environmental problems are woven into who we are and woven into how our society is organized. They're not technical issues over there that experts can surgically solve. In fact, environmental problems are just as complicated as racism or gender inequality. These are deep social problems that have evolved over centuries, and we will not solve them in a deeply, kind of surgical, expert-based technical way. But they are saturated with who we are, in the same way that gender inequality is, in the same way that racism is. But sometimes environmental problems, people think, oh, there must be a technical solution to that. Right? But nobody thinks there's a technical solution to racism. That it's a social thing that we have to wrestle with in terms of very, very complex realities. And the third example is from Arlie Russell Horschild, which kind of gets at this ethical sense. She says, this idea of the commercialization of intimate life. Right? So here's this, what? That's kind of a jarring statement, right? The commercialization of intimate life. And what she looks at is how we care for our children in modern Western society. And the fact that so often now we hire domestic help to do it. And what's that about? Right? What's that about? So this idea that, and she reflects on what happens in feminism. 40 years ago, feminism, the idea was that feminism was going to humanize men. And as she argues, what it's done instead is capitalize women. The women have been absorbed into the market. And the result of that, of course, is they have to hire somebody else to love their kids. They're too busy. So this idea of increasing saturation of family life. So we're sort of wrestling with these examples. We're trying to struggle, okay, well, what's going on with care? These are kind of three examples where we recognize there's sort of a problem here, right, in terms of how we've organized ourselves as a society, in terms of care. And as I say, she studies the whole sort of lives of domestic workers, of course. And I mean, this whole sense that, Filipino nannies are so loving. And here's a sort of deeply problematic term, right? If you sort of pause and reflect on that this idea somehow there's something innate in a Filipino nanny, why they're so wonderful, loving. But what it does is it absolves us of any politics. It's just sort of this natural entity that comes into your life and cares for your kid. No, she's not naturally loving. She's lonely as hell because she's got 5 kids back in the Philippines and she's miserable and stuck in your basement. And there she tends to dote on your child as a result. So that's the more uncomfortable kind of analysis, right? It makes us have to sort of pause and think a little bit about what the heck we're up to. Whereas we just say, oh, they're loving, then we're kind of off the hook, right? Guilt-free. So what we end up seeing here then is that, normally when we talk about globalization and resource exploitation, we think, well, the North is appropriating the resources of the Southern Hemisphere, the carrying capacity of the Southern Hemisphere to support our prosperous way of life. But we're also appropriating their carrying capacity. Not just their carrying capacity, not only their resources, we're also exploiting their love. We're importing their love, and they're diminished as a result. So they not only have unsustainable lives because we need all their resources to support us, we also are diminishing their lives in personal terms by importing affection from the South, right? So care has become commodified. So this is just to kind of get us going here to think, oh, well, geez, care is in a tough spot, right? It's in a tough territory. And so then we have this idea of failure of kind of care, right? So we're trying to reflect on care in a larger world that works against our most personal social fields, right? So there is a disjunction, right? We recognize there's a kind of disjunction here. And this is especially, of course, those with the least power and authority in our culture are the ones who suffer most, right? The most marginalized groups experience this most intensely. I do a lot of work in Jane Finch neighborhood, and it's a shakedown every day as far as, from their point of view, right? So it's a very difficult, contested territory, right? So we have this idea, we could sort of, in a general say, capital seems to abhor all communities but itself. It's inserted itself into the middle of our families. It's kind of, the university, we're experiencing, anybody's been in the university for a while, you see over time the way sort of neoliberal capitalism starts, the new budget models and everything else start to saturate the university. So this place, university used to be kind of an alternate pole, an alternate community that was outside of the market. And we used to protect that, very, very, very jealously. But now we see that model is saturated, it's beginning to saturate the thinking even within universities, right? So not only in families, we see this and so the York University is being, taken over in terms of thinking, right? In terms of this idea that, that capital abhors all communities but itself. So let's think about this in sort of two kinds of examples. Here we are to the idea of hysteria. So we're going to look at sort of personal terms in terms of mental illness, how this gets conceptualized broadly. I'm not an analyst, so I'm not going to try and say that these are sort of very precise. I'm not a specialist in psychology, but these are terms that are debated in a kind of broader social sense, right? In terms of my background is in history, right? So this in terms of history of these kinds of things. And then I'm going to say a few things in sort of general kind of systemic ways. So first thing, I'll look at this idea of hysteria and paranoia as a way to kind of get at this tension between care and larger dominant realities, right? And so in terms of hysteria, the broad definition of hysteria is the over-identification with those around you. Right, so like what's happened to our world where identifying with people around you has become an illness, right? Normally we think that's a good thing, right? But why does it generate a crisis? The over-identification with, some people are over-identifying with those around you. That's, normally I think that's a good thing, right? So what's going on that it generates a crisis, right? And this is just an example. Awa Ong studied Malay factory workers, female factory workers working in computer factories in the free trade zone in Malaysia. And these workers would have hysterical fits on the shop floor. They would be so, level of dehumanization in terms of going around basically in hazmat suits and being totally controlled and regulated every minute of their day. They would have complete breakdowns, go into fugue states. The whole place would be overrun by hysterical fits. They'd have to bring in the witch doctor to get the haints out of the place, right? And so it's a kind of form of protest against modern economic realities. So this idea, so there is, what we're getting at here is that that there's something, an idea, a field of self. So think about this idea, we all have fields of self. Right? And I think there is a sense in which in other historical periods, this was a more amorphous, open thing. And we kind of existed in the world around us more. We, in terms of, we inhabited a space, but of course when that space becomes antagonistic, and we do inhabit a larger space, we experience that as a crisis. And you can actually, if you go and look like where hysterical fits happen, well, you can actually map it in terms of societies that were exposed to capitalist relations. Like Luddites, you could argue, were experiencing these kinds of things, right? But and of course, women have experienced this most recently in terms of when they entered the workforce, right? But in fact, you can chart this so that there is this kind of, it's kind of a rebellion against factory work and these sorts of things, right? By people who aren't skin encapsulated necessarily, who have a more amorphous sense of who they are because of that, whether agrarian societies, whatever they've come from, right? So, and of course, in the context of the disciplining that happens in this territory, they're branded as ill, as having the failures of the uninitiated, right? To have these kinds of fits is a failure in terms of efficiency and work, and they're individualized and pathologized, and are dealt with by the medical institutes, right? So they're not seen. This is not seen as a social problem. This is seen as an individual problem. And this is dealt with medically. And they're fired, or whatever, the instigators are fired, right? So this idea, but the phrase that is, to me, is kind of haunting is the ghosts disturb only the new girls. So this sense of coming up against these alienating relations generates a crisis or a trauma in terms of how people think about themselves. Right? So this idea that ghosts disturb only the new girls, right? But here we are in the middle of modernity, and we all feel okay, right? And it's important to sort of pause and recognize that this is not necessarily normal, right? So we have adjusted. But when you look at something like this, it sort of makes you pause and say, well, hold on, actually capital relations are quite weird. And other people experience what we regard as normal as a crisis in terms of how we live. So it's important when we're thinking about care, just to sort of pause and not just assume ourselves as a kind of benchmark for thinking about these things. To make the present strange. To pause and kind of make the present strange for a minute, right? We don't just accept as a given. Because we're in a mess. I mean, I'm talking about environmental problems, and we're failing to deal with them. So we're trying to remove, that's the place we start, right? So we're trying to make the present a bit strange because we recognize we're in a bit of a mess. And it's a social mess, right? It's not a technical mess. It's not a failure policy mess. I'm arguing it's a social mess. Don't worry. In terms of how we think about ourselves, larger world. So then here's paranoia, which, so we can associate hysteria with that entry into modern economic relations. And paranoia is what happens inside of it. And when we think about what the difference between hysteria and paranoia is a kind of loss of animation. That we've been driven indoors somehow. Right? And so the thing we value now in terms of living in this modern world is somehow we have an internal reality. That our most of our meaning is inside. I would argue probably not, right? I think I would argue, I'd make a case for, we've been merely driven there as a defensive maneuver. And to try and live in there, we don't have a lot of resources. We need the world around us. We need people to love us. We need to feel at home in places to be healthy. And so when we think about things like paranoia and schizophrenia, these are people who are thrown back on their own resources, and they're not enough. And they have a breakdown. Because the world around them is corrosive. And life is not. Right? So this is the kind of new kind of insanity that replaces hysteria. We're talking about inside our modern economic relations, right? And so here's Ernest Becker. He says, he defines paranoia as creative ingenuity from a desperate position. Puts concern back in a world where there is so little, right? So the idea of negative care appears with paranoia, right? People care, but they care in a negative way. They're watching you. Surveillance, right? So this is the part of paranoia, right? Which is arguably new and something we could associate with the kinds of world we're in now, but not with other kinds of worlds. So we're trying to historicize things like hysteria and schizophrenia, right? We're trying to historicize them as associating them with particular historical periods. And so once again, so this is an important kind of definition we think we can make a lot of. Louis Sass, he wrote a book called Madness and Modernism. He said that madness is not the loss of reason. It's reason alone and the loss of appropriate feeling. So I think we could sort of, hey, thinking about care, right? So reason alone and the loss of appropriate feeling. So, we only have reason to fall back on that. That's where the paranoia comes from. That's where the world gets overanalyzed in terms of schizophrenia. There's sort of things lose their organic whole and fracture. Because we don't have that animated sense of being in the world. Right? So here's that kind of sense then of once again, we've been kind of driven indoors. And are those resources sufficient to carry us through? So that's why I'm trying to make use of this hysteria paranoia, just to sort of make the present a bit strange, right? So we can sort of pause for a minute. So we're wrestling with this idea of care and why nature doesn't do very well. And there's another, just I'll toss a couple more in here. There's Paul Shepard. He says that the real bitterness of modern social relationships has its roots in the vacuum where a beautiful and awesome otherness should have been encountered. Right? That somehow there was something outside of ourselves that we should have imprinted on us that didn't happen. And that's generated a kind of bitterness in our lives. Right? So, and these things, they're not individual, they're systemic, they're social. So once again, we're trying to get at why has care failed? So in linking on Becker, Sass, and Shepard, any environmental ethic will need to reflect on the extended sense of self that has ceased to be part of who modern humans are, right? So we tend to displace it. What happens, I use the term animated elsewheres, right? So we create a heaven to explain the misery here. We create wilderness, these animated elsewheres, to explain the misery here. We displace it elsewhere because our lives, we recognize it can't operate in the context we're in now. These sorts of, a sense of richness, vibrancy. So we displace it elsewhere. And so I guess, we arrive at this very tough spot where we think, well, maybe we got to reclaim a social realm. To somehow, the social constriction has taken place. We've constricted ourselves, and this has affected how we care. And this has affected the policy decisions we make about the environment and nature conservation. And that somehow we have to sort of start reflecting on this idea of the social, right? So it's a bit like feminists when they say, take back the night, right? take back the night from those idiots, right? That we have to reclaim that space for ourselves if we're going to do something about, in terms of feminism, about patriarchy and assault and these and violence, these kinds of things in environmental studies, in terms of caring about the natural world. So here, let's just sum up the mess we're in here now, right? What kind of hole have I got this into? Let's reflect on how I problematize these challenges, right? In an unequal world that is destroying nature and creating injustice, we seem to be unable to manifest care in a meaningful way that changes things. The world seems locked into an autopilot of destruction. So once again, I spent many years as an East Coast fisherman, right? So, which completely collapsed and destroyed 50,000 people's ways of life overnight. So I don't feel very beholden, so I can say these catastrophic things and I feel entirely empowered in doing so, right? Oh, that's it. So those with the least power experience this rapaciousness most intensely when it's degraded and commercialized, right? So this happens unevenly. This rapaciousness happens, and we recognize that as well, right? And we can have this very uncomfortable conclusion that a case can be made that modern humans no longer have the emotional capacity for the care necessary to make changes in terms of how we think about nature conservation. Right? That somehow there's a deficit. We have a deficit. This loss of appropriate feeling we've experienced. Another way to sum this up is the idea of a double disappearance. So not only is nature disappearing in terms of species and habitat, right? The social basis that links us to the wider life world is also disappearing. So there's a social disappearance that's accompanying the loss of species and habitat. And these things work together, right? And so the environmental problem can be seen as a social problem linked to a social constriction in modern life. And it's very difficult. So here's a sort of difficult spot we sort of arrive at. Two very prominent political theorists make this comment. Here's Tony Judd, he just died a couple of years ago. The market requires norms and habits external to itself to hold it together. But it also tends to corrode those same practices and sentiments. And here's Wolfgang Streck, he just published a book called The End of Capitalism. He says, what makes capitalism toxic is its expansiveness, its relentless colonization of the rest of society. Capitalism destroys its own foundation. So we can pause, so we sort of pause and take those rather dire comments in, right? In fact, so the standard procedure, the status quo, the default position of our day is eating up our lives. That capitalism is eating up foundations it did not create, but entirely depends on. And so it's not a benign situation we're in here now. We're in the sense of there is this cold solvent being poured over us that I'm arguing is affecting how we care. And we actually got ourselves in quite a hole as a result. And so, let's think about this. So, just let's think, how are we doing for time?
A few minutes. Say
Okay.
2 minutes.
10?
2 minutes?
2 minutes? Oh, God.
Give
So-
me 5 then. 5.
Okay, give me 5. So just to kind of sum up here now, so how can we think about getting ourselves out of this? So Karl Polanyi, in broad terms, he argues that we live in an inverted world. We live in a world that's been turned upside down, right? And that capital relations dominate. And humans in nature have become the passive material upon which capital acts, right? So here's the kind of sense, well, when we ask ourselves, why do we live in the kind of world where care doesn't assert itself? Well, we live in an inverted world where the dominant conversation are commodities talking the language of price on the stock market. And we rush around doing their bidding. That's, in terms of planning, that's I don't want to, just a couple of final things. And so we end up with a sense, well, how can we expand the social realm, right? Environmental ethic would need to problematize current disembedded relations by expanding the conception of the social to include nature. So here's this thing that I think is most important in terms of reflecting on nature, is recognizing that nature is a social world. It's not just a social construction, but in fact is a deeply social world, which we have a huge inheritance from. We inherited a lot of sociality out of the natural world. Nature is full of conviviality and manners. And so by turning it into a utility, we have denied ourselves a kind of basis for thinking in viable terms about nature conservation. Here's John Livingston, his comment here in terms of, which always makes university people uneasy, but he says it's the wholeness of the wild animal that distinguishes it from the experientially deprived domesticate. It is the wholeness of the wild animal that makes ethical constructs unnecessary, indeed probably unthinkable. Why create an abstract set of rules and guidelines when you are already doing all the right social things and always have? Why seek replacement parts when you are complete? Rules and guidelines are for domesticates, infantile, self-centered domesticates, right? So he's saying that, so here we have a sense that what we've lost is this animated sense of who we are. And this is what underscores and underwrites a viable social world, a richness we inherited from the natural world, and viable ways to think about the natural world, right? And this final kind of comment here. When we think about elephant conservation, right, there's just sort of one example that I can bring forward here. Charles Siebert says, when we think about elephant conservation, he discusses the difficult leap that a fellow creature, as ostensibly unlike us in every way as an elephant, is as precisely and intricately woundable as we are. Right? So the sense that there's precisely and intricately woundable as we are, and he calls for a kind of interspecies empathy. Conservation is a social problem. We need to learn how to live with elephants, and so by generating a fundamental shift in how we understand them, and by extension, how we understand ourselves. And he finally just says that we have impoverished ourselves as we have impoverished nature, right? So this is what's happened. So as we turn nature into utility, we've done the same thing to ourselves. Right? So if we're going to extricate nature from just being this utility, this resource we need, we have to do the same thing to ourselves. And once we do that, we can end up with, as Siebert argues, a mutually beneficial interspecies culture. That becomes a kind of viable basis then for a kind of environmental ethic. And it not only addresses nature conservation problems, it also challenges a lot of misery we've generated in society, right? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, it's time for questions now. And perhaps I can start with the first question. Ray, you've been described as an optimist with a catastrophic sense of reality. And we see both sides here, don't we? The catastrophic reality and the optimism. And I just feel that the catastrophic sense of reality perhaps is so intense and so extreme that despite the loftiest optimism can't prevail. Is there any sense in which there's an overriding Nietzschean nihilism, perhaps?
No.
No?
That's a good. That's
Yeah.
a very good question, Bill.
Yeah.
Excuse
So-
me, Mr. Rogers and Mr. McHugh, I have to.
Bye-bye.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the music. That was wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well done. Yay. So thanks, Bill. Yeah, so I guess the idea of optimism, right? So the idea of optimism, I think, like all of you here, you're in university, right? And the most important thing to do is have a intellectual adventure.
Yeah.
And that's a deeply optimistic act. And so to take a situation seriously
Well, you know.
is a very optimistic thing to do. And even if it is a kind of dire, I think it's important, right, as yourselves, especially young people who want to grapple with the kind of world we're in, to engage and really take seriously the kind of mess we're in, is an optimistic act. And so optimism isn't about success and failure. Optimism is about who you are as a human being. right? And to sell out and run off and sell stocks tomorrow, you'll be successful, but you'll be pessimistic in my view. I mean, because optimism is who you are as a human being, in an ethical sense, right? So this idea of, so I'm just saying, optimism is an ethical act, right? So that to be on an intellectual adventure is an optimistic act. And even if the outcome of the analysis is dire, you don't just sort of decide, okay, I'm going to be optimistic and therefore have positive outcomes. Optimism has to do with how seriously you take yourself as an ethical being and how seriously you wrestle with the complicated world we live in. That's an optimistic act. And so even if the outcome of the analysis seems a bit dire, at least one has come to terms with one's historical moment a little bit, right? And not just sort of said, just sort of, oh, things are great, right? And that's easier. Well, it's not easier. That's a short, you're shortchanging yourself as an ethical human being to just paper over something and feel bad, right?
Any other questions?
I'd like to challenge your assertion that things are really going to pause. Your statement that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Maybe both the rich and poor are getting richer. At least if we compare the living standard of our great-grandparents in North America and Western Europe, they were very poor compared to the lifestyle that even the poorest people now in North America have. My graduate students, they say when they go home to China, they just see huge dramatic improvements in standard of living. Granted, there is a pollution problem. India these days can feed itself. You don't hear about famines in India, whereas 40, 50 years ago you did hear about famines and thousands of people dying. Africa has problems, but it's largely because of these civil wars. So I think one could make a case that things are getting much better, especially if you were to take the baseline of the 1930s and 40s with the Depression, World War II. So I just throw it out there and was just wondering what your response was.
Well, yeah, sure, that's fine. I think certain segments of the world are certainly living much better than they ever have. But, I mean, the UN's done 3 or 4 studies in the last decade, and in fact they found that the difference between the rich and the poor is getting wider and not narrower, in fact. And so that, in the context of neoliberal globalization, I mean, there is a sense of opening up markets and access and all these kinds of things, which tend to generate, displacement of people going to the cities, these kinds of things. So that's sort of yes, there is a general increase in prosperity among particular groups, but in fact, when you look at the difference, is getting more unequal. So I guess that's my main point. I mean, yes, certain people, India is feeding more people than they ever have, but in fact, the difference between who has wealth and who is poor is expanding. Even if there is a sort of a small rise in terms of standard, sort of assessments in terms of, calories per day or something like that. But in fact, the difference between the rich and poor is expanding. That's how I respond.
Yes, go ahead.
I want to say a comment that a friend of mine, and he has schizophrenia, she said a really odd thing to me. She said, when I'm around, she's around me, she hears no voices. So how do you explain that most of the time she hears voices, but around me she doesn't? How does that explain her life?
Well, you're probably a very good person and very, very consoling and caring for her. That would be I'm not an analyst, right? So I'm just saying.
I mean, psychiatrists would say that they have associates and people that they talk to, but when she's with me, she doesn't have this. And I'm trying to figure out whether she could find people that she could hang out with and not have to worry about being so exhausted, because I know the schizophrenia is very, very exhausting.
No, I think she's probably comforted by it.
Interesting one case study.
Yeah, so she's comforted by you. That would be my assumption. Yeah.
Yes.
I was kind of moving back, so I'll come back.
All right.
Yes, Jim. I'm trying to wrap my head around the larger framework of your talk. And I'm trying to imagine how change is going to come about. I see the change you want to occur. I'm just not sure I see how it's going to occur. When you have, I quite agree that capitalism is a very powerful mechanism, and it has a very powerful set of institutions that surround it, and ideologies, and I can't see, it seems to me you're approaching this from the perspective, perhaps, I don't know, of a social psychologist. And if you take a sociological or economic perspective and look at capitalism, I can't see how desires to overcome senses of alienation and so on are going to create a critical mass capable of doing anything until capitalism itself begins to encounter internal contradictions.
Right.
So I just wonder where the emphasis is better put, trying to identify the internal contradictions that might promote change versus hoping for a social psychological.
Right, I think, I would not try to individualize this as a kind of thing. I think that you need certain constituencies, and I think you need certain groups so I totally agree with you that we are, the powers, the disciplining abilities of capitalism to, when you get your banking card spit back at you with no money in your account, and you get disciplined very seriously, right? So these are very, very powerful forces that are operating on us every day, right? And so that, and what really I'm offering here is that somehow we, in the face of very, very contested territories and very, very powerful forces, I'm asking us to become more vulnerable to some extent by not accepting the bully's power, by stepping out. And it's stress-inducing and difficult. And of course, the only people who do that now, and this is how I respond to your question, are, for example, Indigenous people. Who have this kind of constituency of a social sense of themselves, who have a kind of some sense of community, even and some sense of territory sometimes, that can begin to provide. So my response is we need certain constituencies, collectivities. We can't do this individually, I don't think. This has to begin, we have to recognize that there are groups in the world who maybe have all these various factors that can stand up to, like the Chiapas in Mexico have that ability in terms of social cohesion and recognition of who they are and access to land, that can begin to challenge some of these forces, right? To say that, no, we think about the world differently, we think about economics differently, all these sorts of things. But I think there's something to be learned, from my point of view then, we can look to them to some extent when we wrestle with how we have to deal with our own sense. There is some hope in that, right? There's some affiliation there that we can recognize, but I think in terms of ourselves, I think, yes, we're up against a profound challenge in terms of...
Can I just have a supplement? Because it sounds to me, I'm old enough to remember this stuff, it sounds to me a lot like the 60s, and some of my friends moving out into communes and getting back into touch with nature and rejecting the ideological demands of capitalism and relating to the communities that you're talking about and honoring them. And I also see what happened to all those communes. And,
no, I'm not arguing for that. No, but look at York University. You say you've been around here, you've seen the changes, right? Mm-hmm. This is a community that has suffered greatly in the context of it. So you don't have to go to the commune to do that. There are forces at work within the university that are dealing with these same battles, right? In terms of budget models and all these. So there are communities everywhere, that are under threat, and that, if all we did was focus on York University, we would have a lifetime's work out of this.
I'm wondering what your advice would be to those of us who are on this intellectual journey and are optimistic about the future and looking to help in this cause in some way. What sort of career directions you would be advising?
That's a good one.
Can I ask that?
Trust, yeah, two of my students are doing this to me. How can I do?
In the context of how, what would you say, consciousness is self-eliminating. So when you have this, perhaps this supposed consciousness, and yes, I'm one of your students, so I'm like very much on side with all of your arguments. How do you, like, I find myself day to day in this place of real cognitive dissonance, kind of like hitting me in the face, especially in the city. At the various locations, but in urban centers, I find it difficult to kind of reconcile with that we're sort of locked into this capitalist machine in a sense. I feel that in my body some days. I also have a small business. I feel it really hard to come up against the capitalist machine when you're trying to run a small business. But I also think there's a huge difference between corporate capitalism and small business capitalism. Anyway, so yeah, when too much. And what are you gonna do with this? And what are you gonna do for all the people who are gonna become unemployed because of the auto industry? You know, like, how do you sort of, optimism is, it's so important right now, and it is an optimistic journey, but I find a lot of the time I'm not optimistic.
Yeah, no, I wasn't, when I'm quoting Hardin saying conscience is self-eliminating, I'm not necessarily saying it, I'm just saying, here's a very, very, probably the most powerful metaphor in environmentalism, and he's saying this. I'm not necessarily totally agreeing with him, right? I don't think it's self-eliminating. You know, when you run a small business, so if he wants to go off and be an academic and make change, we all have to struggle with, as I say, we have to take yourself seriously as an ethical person and as an intellectual. And do the things you love. That's the only thing that anybody can do, right? In terms of the world, right? I mean, we live in it's a hard place, right? We live in a difficult. But I come from a rural place. I come from Nova Scotia, and I ended up here because the fishery collapsed. So I went the opposite direction. So I have survivor's guilt in terms of my career. Like I made a career out of the collapse of the fishery, right? So that you know I was actually in Toronto hammering nails, building houses. I just built a new boat when the fishery collapsed, and so I was in debt. My salary, my income had been garnished by Revenue Canada, and I was here hammering nails whenever the fishery would die out to pay for my boat in Nova Scotia. So at which point my wife shoved me in the door of environmental studies, saying, "You might want to do something else with your life. This doesn't seem to be working, right?" So I went. But I'll always feel, to some extent, displaced. So what you're hearing a displaced person. You know, I've arrived and ended up at York University, but I'm always an immigrant to some extent, right? So you're hearing somebody who's been displaced out of a community, right? And so has struggled. So these things are, I still feel like I got post-traumatic stress, right? So from all the changes that have gone on. Right? So you're not hearing someone from within the system. You're hearing someone from outside of it, who's happy to wheedle his way in. Right? So.
What is your advice for creating effective dialogue with people who are in the system and believe very much in the system, like some of my friends who have graduated with economics degrees and so forth, who use the system to their advantage? What are your recommendations for initiating a peaceful dialogue and getting them to understand this issue outside of their own life?
These are difficult struggles, right? I mean, everybody's different, right? So every individual person would have. I don't have a plan to change the world, but I just recognize the whole. I think what I've outlined is the whole world. So if you start having conversations with people in terms of that you're living your life in a particular kind of way that we can, so the whole argument, the kind of human we are and the kind of nature we want to conserve are identical. That there is a social impoverishment there that we're locked into now. We're human resources. Nature is a natural resource. And these two things are the passive entities upon which capital acts, right? And that's, to me, that's an uncomfortable place to be, right?
I'm just wondering, so when you give an example of the girls in the factories having those hysterical fits and then taken to the shaman, or indigenous communities and their larger social and I just feel like it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, you're looking at it in a way of like a spiritual well-being deficit. So I'm just wondering, in this society, if we have lost our ancient rituals and roots as immigrants, as people who lose these things, as you are displaced, how do you find that now? Is it something you see as that should be ancient and passed down and inherited, or do you see it as something we can create that's new?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, you and I have had this conversation. See, another one of my students asking me these hard questions. So, but I mean, there is a sense in which, in developmental terms, and this is John Livingston has written about this, one of the people I quote there. I mean, I would argue that we're losing keys on our piano, right? We're one-note wonders stumping at our dreary anthems to capital, right? The keys in our piano have become diminished, and I think the sense of recognizing that we have lost these keys on our piano, that in fact there is a more complex, nuanced way to be in the world that is currently offered to us. I mean, we're all historical beings, right? This has become normal for you as you grow, as young people coming into this world, but it's not the only way to think about yourself. So the most important thing is for any student in university is to historicize themselves and recognize that what comes out of their mouth is not necessarily them, it's the world talking. right? And that your job as a university student is to say, well, no, that's not me, that's the world, and this is me. And have this debate with yourself. And it's not a simple thing, but it's the tiny voice the world talks you out of. But you have that person inside you, and as you inhabit this world, you engage in a nuanced conversation. It says, no, hey, I'm not comfortable, that's not me, I'm an actor in a play and I didn't write the script. And I don't like those things. I've been given these lines by the world I'm currently in, and those aren't my lines are the, and so this is what your job as a university student is to have that conversation with that tiny voice within you, right? And recognize, oh no, I have to situate myself. If I'm going to have a decent life, and I'm going to have some regard for myself and the people around me, I'm going to be able to love people and do all these other things, I need to have some kind of sense of my own richness. Right? I tell students, you've got to tell yourself a story that makes you strong. Right? So I've trotted in a very dire scenario here to some extent, but I mean, the most important thing you can do in your life is tell yourself a story that makes you strong. In the sense that I have this rich, and to me, recognizing that we have a social legacy out of the natural world that we have ignored. That somehow we thought when we started living in having division of labor and living in villages and towns, that suddenly the social appeared and sociology could. No, our social legacy is in the natural world. And if this world is carrying on and surviving as well as it currently is, it's because of this amazing conviviality that all of us have inherited out of nature. It's not, we didn't do that in urban terms. So this is back to Judd's comment about that's the solvent that's being eaten up. We have a huge, immense legacy in the natural world. It's convivial, full of manners, it's social. And that is an invitation to health. To me, it's a huge, in terms of strength, I draw immense strength from that in terms of who we are as human beings. And we have this immense, amazing majesty that we've turned into a utility. No, stop having it be utility and look to it as a kind of source of richness and vibrancy and momentum in terms of who you are as a human being. Right? And that's a very powerful thing. Right?
Yes, ma'am.
So could it be argued based on what you were just saying, Ray, that we are being convinced that we have become this deadened, but in reality, we actually turn around, we see that that is not necessarily true. And so, having said that, with this condition of displacement that you talk about, which in my view is actually fairly much richer than if you had stayed in just one place forever. Well, not much richer, but allows you a certain kind of perspective of being in two. You are displaced, but you are richer in that sense because you have an awareness of difference, of worlds changing, of different possibilities. So could it be argued that maybe from this displacement, caring for that displacement might be a place where we could find some answers? And I just reread yesterday Harding's The Tragedy of the Commons, and I was so pissed reading it.
Oh, it's awful. Yeah.
It's awful, and I thought when you were repeating today, consciousness is self-eliminating, I was thinking, yeah, only if you think that there's only one playing ground. And I think this is our biggest mistake, and it's not our mistake. We keep being funneled into this place of thinking, this is the sandbox, you do whatever you want within here, when in fact there's the world out there. And so I think displacement can constantly remind us, the margins can constantly remind, and the margins are not even marginal anymore.
No.
This is the thing. Like you said, we're eating our eyes. We have to start eating our eyes because the system is eating itself. Otherwise it won't survive. But it's a conundrum because it's killing itself in a way.
Yeah, so I guess there is a huge amount of, so that the way to sort of wind up a little bit. So there is an immense amount of optimism. And the negativity had to do with conceptualizing we're in a miserable spot at the moment, I think, in terms of what Tony Judd and Wolfgang Schreck are saying in terms of the social constriction that's gone on. But there is this, what Livingston talks about the huge legacy we have in the natural world. Polanyi is talking about reciprocity and redistribution, all these other social realms that are out there that are outside of market capitalism, that are not disembedded, that have an immense offering for us in terms of thinking about alternative ways to be in the world. So this sense there's a kind of, I guess the optimism is that if you do the kind of heavy lifting analytically, you generate space to think about yourself in a new way. So that would be my optimism, Phil, back to your first question. So to engage in the kind of analytical project and the kind of heavy lifting that this kind of analysis involves generates a kind of fluidity, a lucidity, a kind of openness that allows us to begin then to think about us, who we are, in a more rich, robust way. That's the optimism. I said. So the misery is only the starting point. It's then an invitation to look at different ways of being in the world.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry. Just to go on that, then, in terms of the specificity of kind of going from the misery to like opening to perhaps non-human centric worldview, I'm sure, well, I know you know that there's a lot of specifically feminists
Yep.
kind of writing in a way that really opens up the language that we use around nature. And so if you're talking about nature as not just a social construction but a world in itself, do you support the like alternative language around, more than
Entirely.
more than human world,
Sure, yeah, totally.
non-human
Yep.
nature? Like there's so many and so many
Yep.
of them don't work, and I'm wondering what you're in favor of.
Well, I think, to me, Livingston, he says, in the functioning multi-species community, all participants are subjects. Right? We live in a world where I made a case that we live in a world dominated by the participation of objects, commodities, and so everything's objectified, and it's the sense of so as opposed to participation of objects in a disembedded world, inverted world, we talk about the participation of subjects. No one's exploited, no one's objectified. It's all beings, and this is his definition of nature. In a functioning multi-species community, all participants are subjects. So that to me is a socially viable definition of the natural world that also describes a biodiversity. Right? So there is that immense, but it's that granting that socialness to the natural world that is a kind of first step, and then there's all the other things you can then bring in, right?
Well, thank you very much, Ray, for that intriguing and challenging presentation. And in acknowledgement of this outstanding presentation, I would like to present a gift to you, Ray.
Oh, thank you.
And this will assuage your optimism.
Oh, Scotch, is it? Must be Scotch.
And mitigate your catastrophic sense of reality.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.